Pastor Daryl is worshiping, I think, in the right place this morning in Texas, where I believe football is a religion. And I believe it falls to me to bring you the message of the greatest musical ever. You can get out your phones, you can Google. I think it pretty much makes everybody's top 10 list. And as you all were coming in this morning, so many of you were sharing your own personal Sound of Music stories. Jeffrey actually conducted the orchestra for the actual production, the clip that you saw of the musical that we showed, which is amazing. And the Trishmans were engaged at the very famous Von Trapp Family Lodge in Stowe, Vermont. So I know all of you have stories, and I certainly do too. I'm 52, and while the musical predated me a few years, the film came out just a few years after I was born. And because my mom was a very talented soprano and played the piano, pretty much the soundtrack of my younger years was my mom playing all of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals on the piano and us singing together. Rodgers and Hammerstein was the duo for Broadway musicals in the 40s and the 50s. It was South Pacific. Can you guys name any of them? South Pacific, Carousel. What was it? Cinderella, the beautiful TV movie Cinderella. Oklahoma. There were so many, and this represented the last of their work together because Hammerstein, who wrote the lyrics, Richard Rodgers wrote all of the music for it. Hammerstein died just a few months before, within the time between the musical and the production of the movie. So Edelweiss was actually their last piece of music that they composed together, and it's just a blessing as somebody who grew up with this to be able to share it with you. The movie captured 5 Academy Awards. It's the 3rd highest grossing film of all time. It's 50 years old this year. And of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein racked up their many accomplishments: 34 Tony Awards, 15 Academy Awards, the Pulitzer Prize, and 2 Grammy Awards. The story is a true one of the Von Trapp family. They were real singers. They grew up in Austria. And of course, the rise of the Third Reich, they resisted, and they did escape, albeit by train rather than in the famous hills that we like to sing about this morning. And they emigrated to the United States and settled in Stowe, Vermont, where they still maintain that wonderful lodge, although hopefully it has heat. You have to ask Jackie to tell you about the lack of heat at the Stowe Lodge. I think the story's a little saccharine. I know it's not my husband's favorite thing, but I confess that I am rather a purist when it comes to the sound of music. Every year, it's on television, and every year they do those horrible cuts to fill in a commercial so they can fit in a commercial every 15 minutes. And inevitably, they cut what I think is just the most gorgeous scene when Maria, in her 15-foot train and gown, comes down the aisle of that cathedral with the nuns singing and how do you solve a problem like Maria, and the bowing and the whole thing. I mean, it's just so beautiful. And I have literally been known to resort to very un-nun-like language, hurling things at the television and turning it off if they dare to mess with that scene. I was very eager to share it with Patrick and Liam, 14 and 17-year-old, but back in the day, I wanted them to see it very early on. I think I had visions that we would kind of hover over the puppets and sing Lonely Goat Herd together. Or maybe we would, stand in the living room and do So Long, Farewell together. But it was at this very preschool, Connie Cleland, the director, called me and said, "Marg, perhaps you shared Sound of Music just a little bit too early with your boys, because it was on this very playground where Liam Clark was showing everyone how to do Heil Hitler and to recruiting kids to be Nazis with him on the playground. He is an out-of-the-box thinker. He is an out-of-the-box thinker. It is at moments like this, and far more daunting ones in marriage, parenting, career, and life, that I do lift my eyes to the mountains and ask, where exactly is that help that I'm promised by the psalmist? Where exactly is that protection in my comings and goings? The psalm says right here that my foot won't slip, and yet I seem to slip up quite a lot. The premise of the musical, of course, is that Maria slips up too. She dares to stay in the mountains too long playing, and she's late for Mass. She sings in the garden during the sacrosanct meditation that's supposed to be silent. And when she's sent to do her job as a governess, she falls in love with the captain, I can't say his name, Christopher Plummer, who's already engaged to that haughty countess who we like to cheer against. On set, too, we know that things were far from perfect. In that glorious opening scene with the mountains, it was all filmed by a helicopter, and the downdraft of the helicopter kept pushing, Julie Andrews over into the grass. So, a million retakes, getting the grass stain off of every smock, Christopher Plummer readily admits that he was intoxicated during several of the scenes. And though they have remained lifelong friends, he described working with Julie Andrews as akin to being hit over the head every day with a Valentine. The littlest girl in the cast, Gretel, did not take to the Austrian food. She ate pastries the entire course of the filming, and she gained so much weight that in that epic last scene when Christopher Plummer had to hoist her on his shoulders and carry her into the hills, they had to bring in a stunt double so he could carry her. And in what's perhaps the greatest public relations slip-up of all time, Maria von Trapp and her family, the real ones, were not invited to the premiere of the movie. And when they inquired about their invitations, they were told there were not enough seats available for them. I think this is the stuff that most of us encounter in the mountain climb of everyday life. Courtesies that are not extended to us or that we fail to extend to others. Injuries and bruises from relationships that are disappointing. Addictions to food and alcohol. The feeling that our family, no matter how hard we try to fix it, is not the magical Von Trapp family singers. A sense of disconnect we have between the stories we want our lives to tell and the stories that they actually do tell. And the feeling that we have on so many days, standing as if we're standing behind a pillar, trying not to breathe, waiting for a flashlight to expose us because our sense of safety in the world is so transitory. We come to this church as the Von Trapps came to the Abbey, looking for the help and safety that God promises. And I know that so many Sundays I do feel that way in these pews, that I can barely breathe because of the weight of the world. Fortunately, Psalm 121 has some deeper advice on which to draw, some deeper wisdoms than a do-re-mi. I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? This is the classic Maria and Reverend Mother moment, I think. We sit there in that chair, the preschool director's chair, the principal office chair, scared to death, because in that moment, our lives look so very different than we envisioned. We fell in love with a person who took us on a path we don't recognize. We chose a career that now seems ill-suited. We gave birth to a child we don't have the slightest idea how to parent. We have a diagnosis too daunting to ponder. And we look out that window at the mountains and expect that the glory of God, the maker of heaven and earth, will show us the way. Just by looking up, by staring at the mountains, the Reverend Mother seems to suggest our answers will come. A couple weeks ago, the New York Times featured an intriguing article that asked, "Can you fall in love with anyone?" It was based on a study conducted nearly 20 years ago in which two people were strangers were asked to sit in a room in chairs opposite one another. They were given questions that they would pose to each other. Again, they're strangers, and they were increasingly personal questions. And then, subsequently, they were asked to stare into one another's eyes for 4 minutes. Staring into a stranger's eyes is a strangely intimate act. And the study eventually showed that the formula was successful, that indeed there were several romantic entanglements among the subjects of the study, and there were several marriages. Indeed, they found that love could be sparked by a long, lingering look. The United Church of Christ blogger Esther Enry writes, "You can fall in love with anything if you stare at it long enough. Even your life. Be careful what you stare at. You can fall in love with anything if you stare at it long enough." The Psalms have that effect on us, like all great poetry and tremendous song lyrics. I go to the hills when my heart is lonely. I know I will hear what I've heard before. We look to the hills and at our own experiences with expectation that we can fall in love again. But notice the psalm goes on to say, "My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip." These verses deliver the same tough love that the Reverend Mother does. They tell us, you don't just get to lift your eyes to the mountains, you actually have to go and sweat it out on the mountain. You actually have to return to the messy, rocky, hard stuff. Not just sit and gaze at the snow-topped Alps and celebrate God's grandeur. I think many of us are like Maria, sure that God's going to make his will known to us in the safety of the convent. The answers will come if we just pray long enough, if we gaze long enough, if we commune with others who are faithful or like-minded. But the psalm makes it clear we worship a meet-me-halfway God. A God who, like the abbess, doesn't let us sit long in the safety of her office. A God whose creation is utterly inspiring and renewing, but who promises comfort and shelter on a journey that we do on our own 2 feet. This past week was the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the factory of death run by the SS, in which an estimated 1 million Jews were killed in gas chambers. Imprisoned and killed too were gypsies and homosexuals, political opponents, the mentally ill. So few of them survived the terrible, inhumane conditions of the concentration camps, sent as they were to hard labor, exposed to the bitter cold, disease, starvation, to the traumas of seeing thousands of people arrive by train each day, only to be marched into the crematorium. The doctor of death stood at the door of the camp and with a flick of a finger sent mothers and children this way or that. And to drown out the cries of the children, do you know what the Nazis did? They turned the music up. They relied on the sound of music to drown out the cries of humanity. Viktor Frankl, the author, psychoanalyst, describes the degradation and abject misery he experienced while imprisoned at Auschwitz in his book. He shares that even in the midst of it, he found strength from thinking about his wife, from whom he was separated, and he didn't know that she had, by that point, passed. He writes, "As we stumbled on for miles, slipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another on and upward. Nothing was said, but we both knew. Each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally, I looked at the sky, where the stars were fading, and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look then was more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth, that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world might still know bliss, be it only for a brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved. Frankl continues, in front of me a man stumbled, and those following him fell on top of him. The guard rushed over and used a whip on them all. Thus my thoughts were interrupted for a few minutes, but soon my soul found its way back from the prisoner's existence to another world, and I resumed talk with my loved one. I asked her questions, and she answered. She questioned me in return, and I answered. Indeed, Frankl says, the only way to survive was to realize that you could still exercise the most important freedom of all, the freedom to determine your own attitude and spiritual well-being. It was that last piece of music that Oscar Hammerstein wrote, Edelweiss, that I think really shares that sentiment, the anthem of the spirit, the song that seems to celebrate a homeland clinging to peace, clinging to love. You can feel it in that musical festival auditorium during the movie as the crowd is permitted to sing it one last time. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, every morning you greet me. Hammerstein has us look again, fix our gaze on the beauty of life, on the possibilities of love, even in the bleakest days. Tucked into Psalm 121 is one last assurance. As we climb these mountains, And we take on terror and war and sadism and injustice. We hear this tiny little mention. The same God who watches over us without slumbering is the God who watched over Israel. The same God who saw the Israelites out of slavery. The same God who was with the disciples the night that Jesus was crucified when they were bereft of hope. The same great love that sustained the survivors of Auschwitz. The God who was with us in the AIDS epidemic, who's with us amid Ebola and all the ills of the world. Corrie ten Boom, the author of The Hiding Place, had already climbed mountains in her life for some time. During the war, her family took in and hid Jews when the Nazis invaded her small town in the Netherlands. Eventually, she and her family were discovered and imprisoned in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where her sister and other members of her family died during the course of their captivity. But after the war, ten Boom wrote her book and spent years traveling and sharing a message of forgiveness and reconciliation. Yet never had she been so tested in her beliefs than once in 1947 when she was approached by a former Ravensbrück guard, a guard that was known to be one of the cruelest. She had just given her standard talk on forgiveness when this man, who did not identify himself, outstretched his hand and thanked her for her presentation. Ten Boom didn't know what to do. She couldn't muster the words, nor the wherewithal to put out her hand. Nowhere in her heart was there a speck of forgiveness, not a speck. She stood before this man, paralyzed by the memory of hatred and pain. Then, quite on its own, she describes her hand extended. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. And she says, "I have never known God's love so intensely as I did then." In a world so very divided, in a world so full of hurt and injustice, we can often be struck dumb. Climbing the mountain, the ascent seems much, much too hard. The rocks are jagged. Our differences even more so. We stand torn between a hillside full of possibility and the muddle with which we are familiar. In those moments, we may call on something bigger than ourselves to find our bearings, to silence the doubt, to find our voice, to do the braver thing. A God who never slumbers is watching over us. Indeed, our Edelweiss is this, that despite our differences, God's love is our common ground, our sweet morning greeting, a promising homeland we have yet to reach. It's a dream that you will need all the love you can give every day of your life for as long as you live. Lift your eyes to the mountains. It's time to climb.